Oak Creek, December 25th. The silence is louder than the crash. The scent of pine and rich gravy hangs heavy in the warm air, masking the rot of a decade-long betrayal. My name is Blaire Lawson, and I am watching my family laugh as I scramble off the dining room floor. They didn't just pull a chair out from under me, they tried to pull my entire existence out from under my feet. They thought erasing my name from the legacy my father built would finally break me. But they forgot one thing about hitting rock bottom: it gives you a solid foundation to tear their whole house down. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The sound of my body hitting the floor wasn't a dull thud. It was a sharp, bone-rattling crack that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of my mother's dining room. But the physical impact wasn't what knocked the wind out of me. It was the silence that followed. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the house was the hiss of the gas fireplace and the muffled chime of a jewelry commercial playing on the TV in the den, cheerfully commanding everyone to cherish their loved ones. From my vantage point on the Persian rug, the room looked distorted, a funhouse mirror of the perfect American holiday. The scent of roasted pine and rich turkey gravy, which moments ago had felt welcoming, now made my stomach churn with bile. I am a risk analyst by trade. My entire career is built on calculating probability, assessing threats, and remaining rational when the numbers turn red. I pride myself on seeing the crash coming before it happens. But I hadn't calculated this. I looked up to see Victor Hale, my stepfather, standing over me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He still had his hand on the back of the heavy oak chair he had just yanked out from under me as I went to sit down. He held it like a shield, or maybe a weapon. "Careful there, Blaire," Victor boomed, his voice projecting that charismatic small-town hero warmth that had fooled half the county. "You're in the wrong seat. That chair is for my real daughter." He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it with a wink. He said it with the casual cruelty of a man who knows he owns the room. At the other end of the table, my stepsister Ivy didn't gasp. She didn't rush to help me. Instead, she brought a manicured hand to her mouth to stifle a giggle, her other hand already angling her phone to capture the aftermath for her story. She looked perfect, stylish, and completely unbothered, basking in the status of being the real daughter. I looked to my mother, Elaine. Surely this was the line. Surely watching her 28-year-old daughter sprawled on the floor in a torn dress, humiliated in front of aunts, uncles, and business partners, would snap her out of her trance. Elaine's eyes darted around the room, assessing the guests, checking for damage to the reputation rather than her child. Her face tightened, not with concern, but with annoyance. "Blaire, honestly," she hissed, her voice tight and low. "Get up. You're making a scene. Why do you always have to make everything so difficult?" The betrayal hit me harder than the floor had. I scrambled to my knees, my face burning. I could feel the eyes of our extended family on me. Some looked away, studying their silverware cowards in expensive sweaters. Others smirked, feeding off the drama. I heard an uncle mutter something under his breath about how I should be grateful they even invited me after all the trouble I'd supposedly caused the family business, a business my father, Mark Lawson, had built from the ground up, and which Victor was now running into the ground while taking the credit. As I pushed myself up using the granite island for support, my eyes locked onto something lying face up on the counter next to the carving knife. It was Victor's phone. He was careless, arrogant. The screen was lit up with a notification, a preview of an email from their family attorney. The subject line was truncated, but the preview text was legible enough for a risk analyst trained to spot anomalies in a split second. "Need to finalize moving the assets before she turns 30 next month. If she sees the trust docs." The world tilted on its axis. The humiliation in my chest crystallized into something cold and sharp. This wasn't just bullying. This wasn't just a bad step-parent dynamic. This was a countdown. My parents had sacrificed everything: integrity, loyalty, the truth, just not for me. They had sacrificed me. I stood up. I didn't brush off my dress. I didn't cry. I didn't scream at Victor or beg my mother for an apology she was incapable of giving. I looked at the empty chair, then at the people sitting around a table funded by my dead father's labor. "Enjoy the dinner," I said. My voice was steady, terrifyingly calm. "I've lost my appetite." I walked out of the dining room past the tree loaded with ornaments that represented a family history I had been edited out of and grabbed my coat. The heavy front door clicked shut behind me, severing the noise of the party. The winter air was biting, freezing the tears I refused to shed against my lashes. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots like breaking bones. As I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, I whispered to the empty car. "Tonight they tried to erase me. But they forgot one thing: I know exactly how to erase people on paper." I started the engine. I should have gone home to my safe, quiet apartment. I should have drawn a bath and forgotten them. Instead, I turned the car toward the industrial district on the edge of town. There was a storage unit there filled with dusty boxes labeled Lawson that Victor had thrown out years ago. If they were going to threaten my existence, I was going to unearth the ghosts they thought they had buried. I drove into the dark, ready to see what my father had left behind. The drive to the storage unit felt like driving backward through time. Every mile marker I passed peeled away another layer of the callous armor I had built up over the last decade, exposing the raw, ugly wound underneath. The humiliation at the Christmas table hadn't sprung up out of nowhere. It was the final coat of paint on a masterpiece of erasure that had taken them 12 years to complete. I let my mind drift back to the beginning, to the time before I was the stepdaughter or the problem. Back then, I was just Mark Lawson's daughter. My father was a man who smelled like pine sawdust and diesel fuel, a blue-collar contractor who built half the foundations in this town. He didn't wear Italian loafers like Victor. He wore steel-toed boots that were scuffed white at the toes. He built Lawson Construction on American values that sound almost archaic. Now you show up early, you pay your debts, you take care of your neighbors, and you build things to last. I remembered sitting on the tailgate of his truck when I was 10, his heavy hand resting on my shoulder as he pointed to the company sign. One day, he'd told me, his voice rough with pride, "We'll paint over the sons and make it Lawson and Daughter." That dream died on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 16. I watched the paramedics work on him in our driveway, the red lights flashing against the garage door, but his heart had simply stopped. In that moment, I learned my first lesson in risk analysis: life will ambush you. It doesn't care about your plans. My mother, Elaine, was devastated. She was a woman who needed to be taken care of, and without Mark, she was a ship without an anchor. It took less than 2 years for Victor Hale to drift in. He met her through the church, shaking hands and speaking in smooth, rehearsed sentences about honoring Mark's legacy. He positioned himself as the rescuer, the selfless businessman volunteering to manage the heavy burden of the company, while a grieving widow recovered. Then came the slow, systematic editing of my life. It started with the company trucks. The bold Lawson Construction logo was stripped away, replaced first by Hale and Lawson Group, and eventually quietly just Hale Group. It was subtle enough that the town didn't blink, but I felt it like a physical blow. Inside the house, the erasure was even more intimate. My father's portraits migrated from the mantel to the hallway, then to the back bedroom, and finally into cardboard boxes destined for the damp storage unit I was currently driving toward. The real knife in the back came on my 18th birthday. I had been accepted to the state university, ready to study accounting to prepare for my role in the company. I sat at the kitchen table waiting for the details of the college fund my father had talked about for years. Victor sat opposite me, looking solemn, while my mother refused to meet my eyes. "The economy has been hard, Blaire," Victor had said, sliding a city bus pass across the table toward me. "The recession hit the accounts hard. The money is gone. You'll have to be resilient. It builds character." I took the bus pass. I took the lecture on resilience. I worked 2 jobs waiting tables while taking full course loads. I convinced myself that struggle was noble. But 2 months later, for Ivy's 18th birthday, there was no talk of recession. There was a brand new white SUV with a giant red bow parked in the driveway. Ivy wasn't going to a state school to study business. She was heading to an expensive private college to major in digital branding. Then, when I confronted my mother shaking with the injustice of it, she just sighed, repeating the script Victor had clearly written for her. "We're a family, Blaire. You need to be understanding. Victor has sacrificed so much to keep this roof over our heads. Don't be selfish." That was the refrain of my 20s. Every year I watched my future get sacrificed so Victor and Ivy could live like their lives were a movie. I was the supporting character who was supposed to fade into the background. When I graduated and asked when I could start at the company, my company Victor laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh which made it worse. It was a pitying one. "You're not cutthroat enough for this industry, sweetheart," he'd said, patting my cheek. "Stick to a safe corporate job. Let the men handle the heavy lifting." But the moment that truly radicalized me, the memory that played on a loop as I pulled up to the chain-link fence of the storage facility, was a mistake they made 3 years ago. I had come home early for a visit and found paperwork spread out on the kitchen table. It was a succession plan draft. I saw my name, Blaire, typed in a clause about future equity, but someone had taken a bottle of whiteout to it. The liquid was still wet, a jagged white scar over my identity. Above it in Victor's handwriting was the name Ivy. They weren't just ignoring me. They were actively rewriting legal reality to ensure I ceased to exist within the legacy my father built. I parked the car in front of Unit 402. My breath hitched in my throat as I stepped out into the biting wind. I rolled up the rusted metal door, the screech piercing the night. Under the flicker of a dying halogen bulb, I saw the wall of boxes labeled Mark, Old. I dug through them, frantically tossing aside old tax returns and manuals until my hands landed on something heavy at the bottom of a crate. It was a dented, gray metal lockbox. Scratched into the paint on the lid in my father's distinct blocky handwriting were the words, "Blaire E. Lawson, do not open without my daughter." My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt around the underside of the lid and found a small brass key taped securely with duct tape that had yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I peeled it off. They thought they had erased me. They thought they had won. But my father had seen them coming. I slid the key into the lock. The lockbox popped open with a metallic snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet storage unit. My breath clouded in the freezing air as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in decaying foam, were 3 items: a silver USB flash drive, a small weather-beaten leather notebook, and a sealed envelope with my name on it. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the letter. I recognized the stationery immediately. It was from the notepad he used to keep on his nightstand. I tore it open. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, as if he wrote it knowing he was running out of time. Blaire Barrett started. The nickname hit me like a physical blow. "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I want to believe the best in people, you know that. But I don't trust Victor. He's too eager to help, too interested in the books, and not interested enough in the work. I've set up protections, a trust, specific clauses in the will, ownership structures that keep the company safe for you. If anyone tries to erase you from this business, it means they know you're the only one who can stop them. Trust your gut. It's smarter than they are." I sat on the concrete floor staring at the paper until the words blurred. He knew. He had seen the wolf at the door even before he died. I didn't stay in the unit. I grabbed the box, threw it in my passenger seat, and drove home to my apartment like the devil was chasing me. I needed my laptop. I needed electricity. I needed to see what was on that drive. Back in the safety of my living room, the glow of my screen was the only light. I plugged in the flash drive. It mounted instantly. Lawson Legacy. I clicked it open. It wasn't just a few files, it was a vault. There were high-resolution scans of the original articles of incorporation deeds to the land the equipment yard sat on, and most importantly, a copy of a trust agreement I had never seen before. I scanned the legalese, my risk analyst brain shifting into hyperdrive. There it was, in black and white, notarized and filed 2 weeks before his death. The majority share of Lawson Construction, shall be held in trust for the beneficiary. Blaire Lawson until her 30th birthday, at which point full control transfers to her. I froze. My 30th birthday was next month. The pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. Victor didn't own the company. My mother didn't own the company. They were trustees, stewards. They had spent the last 12 years acting like owners, but legally they were just keeping the seat warm. And based on what happened at dinner, they knew time was up. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photos I had surreptitiously taken of Victor's screen at the Christmas table. The email preview I had seen earlier suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. Move assets before she turns 30. They weren't just being mean, they were looting the ship before the captain came aboard. They were trying to drain the company of its value cash equipment land so that when I turned 30, I would inherit a hollow shell while they walked away with the wealth. I opened the leather notebook next. This was the smoking gun. In the months before he died, my father had been tracking Victor's help. The pages were filled with scribbled columns. Invoice number 4092. Lumber never arrived. Victor cashed check for $5,000, no receipt. Equipment rental to Hale Shell Co. Fraudulent. My father hadn't just died of stress. He had died trying to catch a thief. And that thief had spent the next decade sleeping in his bed and raising his daughter. A cold, hard fury settled over me. It replaced the sorrow I had felt in the car. It burned away the humiliation of the dinner party. I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen, then at the photos of Victor's debt warnings and Ivy's lavish lifestyle. They hadn't just left me behind. They had used my father's legacy, my inheritance, to finance their cosplay of a wealthy American family. Ivy's tuition, Victor's trucks, the country club memberships, it was all paid for with stolen money. My money. Okay, I whispered to the empty room. You want a war? I'll give you a war. I started building a digital case file. I created a master timeline overlaying my father's notes with public records of the company's revenue. I found discrepancies in county contracts, public funds that had been paid to Hale Group for work that was likely never done. I noted the dates on documents where my mother's signature appeared jagged and shaky, likely signed under pressure or without reading. I compiled it all: the trust, the will, the theft, the fraud. But I knew Victor. If I went to him directly, he'd destroy the evidence. He'd gaslight me, threaten me, maybe even hurt me. He had the town's sympathy. I was just the ungrateful stepdaughter. I needed leverage. I needed something he couldn't charm his way out of. I opened a new email draft. I kept the subject line "Sterile Whistleblower Complaint regarding vendor fraud and misappropriation of assets. Hale Group, formerly Lawson Construction." I attached the folder. Then I typed in 3 email addresses. The first was the State Attorney General's corruption tip line. The second was a forensic accountant who had mentored me at my firm, a woman who ate fraud for breakfast. The third was the personal email of a local investigative reporter in our town, a man named Henderson, who had spent years trying to expose the good old boy network that Victor thrived in. My finger hovered over the enter key. I knew what this meant. This wasn't just a legal filing. This was a nuclear option. Once I sent this, there was no going back to awkward family holidays. There was no reconciliation. I would be torching the only family I had left. I looked at the notebook one last time at my father's handwriting protecting me from the grave. I pressed send. The swoosh sound of the email departing felt deafening in the quiet apartment. I sat back, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at the sent folder, shivering. I had no idea that pressing one button would set my whole town on fire. I expected silence. When you drop a bomb, there's usually that split second of vacuum before the explosion, that intake of breath before the world shatters. I thought I would have days, maybe weeks, to prepare my case, while the slow wheels of bureaucracy began to turn. I was wrong. I had underestimated how quickly a cornered animal strikes back, especially one with Victor's instinct for survival. The first domino fell less than 24 hours after I hit send. My phone buzzed while I was pouring my morning coffee. It was Henderson, the local investigative reporter. He didn't say hello. He just said, "I've been waiting 10 years for someone to give me the ledger numbers on the Hale group. Tell me you have hard copies, Blaire, because they're going to shred everything by noon." An hour later, a notification popped up on my laptop. The State Investigation Unit had officially opened a preliminary file. It was happening. But while the legal gears were grinding in secret, the social war exploded in public. My phone started vibrating incessantly, a swarm of notifications that made it dance across the kitchen counter. A cousin from my mother's side, someone who hadn't spoken to me in 3 years, had posted the video of the Christmas push on Facebook. She had captioned it with crying, laughing emojis tagging Ivy. But the internet is a volatile beast. The comment section had split into a vicious civil war. Half the town was defending Victor as a saint under stress, while the other half was calling it elder abuse, or in my case, daughter abuse. Then came the knock at the door. I looked through the peephole to see Victor standing in my hallway. He was wearing his site visit clothes, clean flannel vest, approachable smile. He waved at my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who was walking her poodle. He looked like the perfect dad stopping by to check on his girl. My stomach dropped, but I unlocked the door. I had to face him eventually. The moment the door clicked shut, the smile vanished. It didn't fade. It simply ceased to exist, replaced by a cold, hard sneer that chilled my blood. He didn't shout. He stepped into my personal space, forcing me to back up against the entryway table. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing rumble. "Going to outsiders, airing our laundry. I'm going to sue you for defamation, Blaire. I'm going to bury you in so much legal debt, you'll be paying me until you're 80. "I have the trust documents, Victor," I managed to say, though my voice trembled. "I know about the invoices." "Nobody cares about paperwork," he spat. "They care about loyalty. You're trying to destroy this family because you're jealous of Ivy. That's the story. And let me tell you something about this town. Americans hate traitors more than they hate thieves." He left as quickly as he arrived, putting the smile back on before he stepped into the hallway. 10 minutes later, my mother called. She wasn't angry. She was hysterical. Between sobbing breaths, she accused me of twisting my father's wishes. "We're a family, Blaire," she wailed. "Why are you sacrificing everything we've built? Why are you doing this to me?" "I'm doing this for Dad," I said, gripping the phone. "He built that company, not Victor." "Your father is dead," she screamed, and the line went dead. The emotional assault was just the softening blow. The legal artillery hit that afternoon. A courier delivered a thick envelope. Victor was suing me for $1.5 million in damages for corporate sabotage, misappropriation of trade secrets, and breach of family trust. It was a frivolous suit designed to bleed me dry, but it had immediate consequences. At 4:00 p.m., my boss at the risk management firm called me into his office. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "We received a letter from Hale Group's legal counsel today," he said, sliding a paper across his desk. "They claim you used confidential knowledge obtained through your employment here to attack a client. We have to put you on administrative review, effective immediately. Leave your badge at the desk." I walked out of the building with a cardboard box of my belongings, stunned. In 24 hours, I had gone from whistleblower to pariah. Victor's PR machine went into overdrive. Ivy went live on Instagram, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, talking about how she was ambushed by her stepsister's lies. She didn't mention the fraud. She framed it as a pathetic, jealous sister trying to erase her because she couldn't handle Ivy's success. "She wants to take everything because she has nothing," Ivy sobbed to her 12,000 followers. The town took the bait. When I went to the grocery store, the cashier, a woman who had known me since kindergarten, wouldn't look at me. I heard whispers in the aisle. Even the Sunday sermon at the local church was titled, "The Sin of Ungratefulness," a thinly veiled attack on me that framed forgiveness as silence and loyalty as submission. I felt isolated, crushed under the weight of a narrative I couldn't control. But every attack, every lie just clarified the truth. They were terrified. You don't deploy an army if you aren't afraid of the enemy. I doubled down. I spent my days in my apartment blinds drawn digging deeper. The cracks in their armor were starting to show. Former employees emboldened by the rumors began to quietly message me on LinkedIn. They sent stories of unpaid overtime of cash jobs that never appeared on the books. One subcontractor, a guy named Miller, who had worked with my dad, sent me a scanned copy of an invoice. It was for materials for a Hale Group project that I knew for a fact was a renovation on Victor's personal lake house. And at the bottom, there was a digital signature approval. Mine. I stared at the screen. I had never signed that. They had forged my signature to frame me for their theft. My phone rang. It was my mentor, the forensic accountant. I picked up, desperate for good news. "Blaire," she said, and her voice was grave. "You need to listen to me. The state investigators just subpoenaed everything. That's good. But Victor's lawyers are playing offense. They've submitted documents to the DA claiming that you were the mastermind behind the financial irregularities. They're saying you set up the shell companies to embezzle from the trust." "That's insane," I said, my heart hammering. "I have the proof." "They have a signature, Blaire," she said, cutting me off. "They have a digital signature on the authorization forms that matches yours perfectly. If they prove that signature is valid, or even if they just muddy the waters enough, this isn't a civil case anymore. You could go to prison." I dropped the phone. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. They weren't just trying to erase me from the family anymore. They were trying to erase my freedom. The hearing was technically a joint session between the State Regulatory Board and a civil circuit judge convened because Victor's contracts with the county involved public tax dollars. But to the town of Oak Creek, this wasn't a bureaucratic procedure. It was the Super Bowl of family drama. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, a sea of familiar faces, neighbors, former teachers, people who had bought Victor's hero act for a decade. I walked down the center aisle feeling less like the whistleblower and more like the defendant walking to the gallows. Victor sat at the defense table looking every inch the aggrieved patriarch. He wore a navy suit that cost more than my first car, his posture radiating a weary, noble resilience. Beside him, Ivy dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the traumatized daughter to perfection. And behind them sat my mother, Elaine. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white, her face a mask of terrified neutrality. She wouldn't look at me. Victor's attorney, a shark from the state capitol, opened the proceedings by painting a masterpiece of fiction. He described Victor as the savior who had rescued a drowning company, sacrificing his own financial stability to honor a dead friend. He pointed a manicured finger at me. "This is not a case of fraud, Your Honor. This is a case of a resentful young woman angry that she wasn't handed a kingdom she didn't earn, lashing out at the man who raised her. We have emails," he continued, holding up a stack of papers, "where Ms. Lawson urges vendors to break contracts with Hale Group. She is the saboteur." The room murmured. I felt the weight of their judgment. They wanted to believe him. It was a better story. Then it was my turn. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my simple black suit. My hands were trembling, but as I touched the cold metal of the flash drive in my pocket, I thought of the storage unit, the cold wind, the lockbox. My voice shook on the first syllable, but then the risk analyst in me took the wheel. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a prosecutor of facts. "The defense tells a good story," I said, my voice steadying, projecting to the back of the room. "But math doesn't tell stories. Math tells the truth." I plugged the flash drive into the court's presentation system. The screens around the room flickered to life. I walked them through the timeline using simple, brutal analogies to dismantle Victor's complex web of shell companies. "Imagine you hire a babysitter," I said, looking directly at the judge. "You give them money for pizza. Instead, they eat the food in your fridge, take the pizza money to buy themselves jewelry, and then forge a receipt saying you ate the pizza yourself. That is what Victor Hale has done with Lawson Construction for 12 years. I pulled up the trust document, the original scan dated and notarized. My father left the company in trust. Victor didn't own it. He was just the babysitter. And he knew his time was up. The room was silent now. The ungrateful daughter narrative was cracking under the weight of timestamps and bank routing numbers. But Victor still looked smug, confident his forged emails would muddy the waters enough to save him. That was when the state investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Miller, stood up. She hadn't just accepted my tip, she had dug all the way to the bedrock. "Your Honor," she said, "the state would like to enter additional evidence into the record." On the screen, a new spreadsheet appeared. It showed a web of transfers from the company operating account directly into accounts labeled Ivy Hale, Education, and Ivy Hale, Personal. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of public contract money funneled into designer clothes and tuition, all categorized in the company books as consulting fees. Ivy stopped dabbing her eyes and went pale. Then Agent Miller called a witness via Zoom. A face popped up on the large monitor, Mrs. Higgins, the company's bookkeeper for 20 years, a woman I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. She looked small and frightened. "He told me to erase her." Mrs. Higgins testified, her voice tinny through the speakers. "Mr. Hale said Blaire was never coming back. He made me white out her name on the deed transfers. He said if I didn't do it, he'd report me for errors I didn't make." Victor's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The air in the room had shifted. The heat was rising. I stepped back to the microphone for the final emotional dagger. I opened my father's worn leather notebook. "My stepfather claims I don't belong in this family," I said quietly, but my father disagreed. I read the line, my voice catching in my throat. "If anyone ever tells you Blaire doesn't belong at this table, they don't belong in this family." I looked up from the page and locked eyes with my mother. "He wrote this the week before he died, Mom." Elaine let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. The judge turned to her. "Mrs. Hale, were you aware of these transfers? Did you sign these authorizations?" Elaine stood up, her legs shaking. She looked at Victor, who was glaring at her with the intensity that promised retribution. Then she looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years. The facade crumbled. "I didn't read them," she whispered, and then louder, "I never read them. He told me to sign and I signed. I just wanted peace. I thought if I let him have the company he would stay. I let him erase her because," she choked on the truth, "because facing my guilt hurt more than losing my daughter." The courtroom erupted. Victor slammed his hand on the table, his face turning a violent shade of red, but the investigator wasn't finished. "One last thing, Your Honor, regarding the defense's claim that Ms. Lawson forged documents." She played a video file. It was grainy black and white security footage from the Hale Group office dated 3 months prior. It showed Victor standing over a terrified junior admin, pointing at a screen, guiding her hand as she used a stylus to replicate a signature. My signature. "We also have 3 anonymous complaints regarding wage theft that predate Ms. Lawson's tip," Agent Miller added. "Ms. Lawson didn't manufacture this case, she just turned on the lights." The climax hit with the force of a gavel strike. The panel didn't even recess. The judge leaned forward, his face grim. "In light of the overwhelming evidence of fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of assets, the court orders an immediate freeze of all Hale Group accounts and assets. Control of the trust is to be transferred to the beneficiary Blaire Lawson, effective immediately, pending criminal charges." The room dissolved into chaos. Reporters were shouting questions. Deputies moved in to secure Victor. I stood still in the eye of the hurricane, feeling a strange hollow ringing in my ears. I had won. The legal system had validated my existence. As the bailiffs moved Victor toward the side exit, he leaned in close to me. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a viper with one last strike left. His breath was hot against my ear. "You think this is a victory?" he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "You just destroyed your own mother's life. When she loses the house, when she loses everything and ends up on the street, remember you chose this." He pulled away, smirking, leaving me standing there with the court order in my hand, forcing me to decide right then and there what justice actually looked like, and if I could live with the cost. The headlines hit the local papers the next morning, screaming in bold black type, "Local business hero accused of $1 million fraud. Stepdaughter reclaims legacy." The town, which had spent weeks treating me like a pariah, fractured again. But this time the split wasn't about opinion, it was about the undeniable weight of evidence. It's hard to call a man a saint when the mugshot is on the front page. Victor was arrested on 12 counts, including wire fraud forgery and misuse of public funds. The image of him being led out of his Hale Group office in handcuffs, his head ducked to avoid the cameras, played on a loop on the evening news. Ivy wasn't spared either. While she wasn't dragged out in cuffs, the state opened a separate investigation into her finances. She was labeled a knowing beneficiary of stolen assets. Her curated influencer life evaporated overnight. Brands dropped her faster than she could delete her posts. The fallout for my mother was quieter, but in many ways more brutal. She wasn't charged criminally, her incompetence and willful ignorance were her defense. But the civil liability was a tidal wave. The big house on the hill, the symbol of her perfect second life, was seized under asset recovery protocols. I watched from a distance as moving trucks took the furniture, leaving her to move into a cramped two-bedroom rental on the edge of town. Victor's whisper in the courtroom haunted me. I had pulled the thread and the whole sweater had unraveled. I took interim control of the company the following Monday. Walking into the office didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like walking into a hostile occupier's camp. The sign out front still said, Hale Group, and the office smelled like Victor's expensive cologne. I had to open the windows just to breathe. The employees were wary. To them, I wasn't the returning heir. I was the woman who had blown up their job security. I spent the first week reviewing ledgers with a court-appointed consultant, feeling the eyes of the foreman burning into my back. I questioned every day if I was actually capable of leading this ship, or if I had just sunk it to prove a point. My mentor urged me to start therapy, and for the first time in my life, I listened. In a quiet office with beige walls, I confronted the uncomfortable truth my entire identity for the last decade had been built around being the victim, the sacrificed one. Without the fight, without the enemy, I felt untethered. Who was Blaire Lawson if she wasn't fighting for her seat at the table? The answer came in the form of a letter from Miller, the subcontractor whose invoice had been the smoking gun. He didn't write much, just a scrawled note on the back of a paid bill. Ms. Lawson, I just wanted to say thank you. Victor had me squeezed so tight I was going to lose my truck next month. Because you exposed the books, the court released my back pay. You didn't just save your dad's company, you saved mine. That letter became my anchor. The betrayal had rippled outward, destroying lives, but the justice was rippling outward too. 3 weeks after the hearing, Elaine asked to meet. She chose a cheap diner near her new apartment, a place with sticky tables and fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped flies. She looked 10 years older. The polished, image-obsessed woman who had scolded me at Christmas was gone. In her place was someone tired, wearing a coat that had seen better days. She didn't start with excuses. She didn't talk about how hard it was for her. She just looked at her coffee cup and spoke the truth. I knew, she said softly. Deep down, I knew he was pushing you out. I saw the way he looked at you. I saw the papers. She looked up, her eyes wet. I let him erase you because facing my guilt hurt more than losing you. I was so afraid of being alone again, Blaire. I sacrificed you for my own comfort. And I am so sorry. It was the apology I had waited 12 years to hear. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and hug her to pretend everything was fine. But the risk analyst in me knew that trust is an asset that once bankrupted takes years to rebuild. I didn't offer instant forgiveness. I couldn't. I appreciate that, Mom, I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm. But I won't go back to how it was. I won't be the secret you keep to make a man comfortable. I won't be sacrificed anymore. Not for Victor, not for this town, and not for you. I laid out the terms. We would go to family therapy. There would be total transparency, and she had to accept that the company, my father's company, was mine. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a real one. In the months that followed, I went to work. We settled with the state agreeing to a strict oversight plan to keep the doors open. I rebranded the company, stripping Victor's name off the trucks and restoring the original Lawson Construction logo, but with a modern update. I implemented open book management. Every employee saw the financials. I raised wages to meet the local union standard. I ran the business the way my father had dreamed, with honor. Then, on the eve of Victor's sentencing, a letter arrived at my office. The return address was the county jail. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope. There was no letter inside, just a photograph. It was a picture I hadn't seen in 20 years. It was me at 7 years old, grinning with a gap-toothed smile, sitting proudly next to my father on the bumper of the very first truck he ever bought. I looked so happy, so sure of my place in the world. I turned the photo over. In Victor's sprawling, arrogant handwriting, he had written, "This should have been yours. I thought I could erase you. I was wrong." I stared at the ink. It was a final psychological barb, an admission of guilt, wrapped in a reminder of what he had stolen. He wanted me to come visit him. He wanted one last scene, one last chance to manipulate the narrative. I held the photo, feeling the ghost of the little girl I used to be. I had to decide whether to give him the satisfaction of an audience or if silence was the loudest sound I could make. 1 year later, the smell of pine and roasting turkey filled the air again, but the suffocating weight that had crushed my chest last Christmas was gone. I wasn't in the cold, vaulted mausoleum of my mother's old house. I was in my own home, a 1920s craftsman bungalow I had spent the last 8 months restoring. The floors weren't cold, imported marble. They were warm, reclaimed heart pines salvaged from one of the old Lawson equipment yard's wood that my father might have handled himself 30 years ago. I walked into the dining room carrying a heavy platter of roasted vegetables. The room was alive. It wasn't filled with the polite, terrified silence of people walking on eggshells around a tyrant. It was loud. There was laughter bouncing off the walls, the clinking of glasses, the sound of genuine conversation. I set the platter down on the table. It was the centerpiece of the room, and arguably the centerpiece of my new life. I had commissioned it from a local carpenter I had put back on the payroll after Victor fired him. It was a massive slab of solid white oak, sturdy enough to hold up the world if it had to. There were 12 chairs around it, but only one mattered to me. At the head of the table, bolted into the wood of the chair back, was a small brass plate. It didn't say stepdaughter. It didn't say guest. It read Blaire Lawson. It was my seat. And this time no one could move me. I looked around at the faces I had chosen to fill those seats. To my left was Miller, the subcontractor, who had helped me break the case, now my foreman. He was laughing with Mrs. Gable, the neighbor whose stolen wages I had recovered during the audit. Further down sat a man I had started seeing a few months ago, an architect who listened more than he spoke, and who understood that I didn't need saving. I just needed a partner who respected my blueprints. And then there was Elaine. My mother stood by the sideboard helping serve the wine. She looked different. The brittle, frozen perfection was gone, replaced by a softness that felt human. She was wearing a simple sweater, not the designer armor she used to wear for Victor. She was attending a support group for spouses of narcissists twice a week, and she was volunteering at a women's shelter downtown. She was still fragile, still carrying the guilt of a decade of silence, but she was here, and she was trying. I thought about the letter Victor had sent me, the photo of my 7-year-old self. I never did go to the jail to visit him. I realized that giving him an audience, even to gloat, would have been giving him power. He wanted a scene. I gave him silence. Instead of a visit, I had sent him a single envelope. Inside was a copy of the original trust documents, the legal proof that no matter how many trucks he painted his name on, he had never owned a single splinter of the empire he tried to steal. I wanted him to sit in his cell and know that the paper, the law, and the truth had remembered my name, even when he tried to make the world forget it. Blaire, I snapped back to the present. My mother was holding up her glass. The room went quiet, but it wasn't the fearful silence of the past. It was a warm, expectant hush. "I'd like to make a toast," Elaine said, her voice wavering slightly before finding its strength. She didn't look at the guests, she looked right at me. To second chances. And to my daughter who taught me that you don't keep the peace by sacrificing the truth. You built this table, Blaire. In every way that matters. To Blaire, the room echoed. I took a sip of my wine, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the alcohol. I looked at the empty chair at the other end of the table, not empty because someone was missing, but empty because I hadn't invited anyone who would drain the air from the room. I felt a profound sense of sorrow for the girl I had been last year, the one who had been shoved to the floor and humiliated while her family watched. I felt the outrage for what had been stolen from her. But mostly I felt a grounded, steady triumph. I hadn't just reclaimed a business, I had reclaimed my own agency. I had taken the wreckage they left me and built a fortress. Victor thought he was destroying me that night. He thought that by pushing me out of my chair he was pushing me out of the family, out of the legacy, out of existence. But as I looked around at the faces of the people who respected me, at the mother who was finally learning to be a mother, and at the home I had built with my own hands, I realized the irony of it all. Victor thought he was pushing me out of the family. What he really did was push me into my life. I sat down in the chair with the brass plate. I pulled it in close to the table, feeling the solid wood against my back. I spread my napkin across my lap and looked at the feast before us. "Let's eat," I said. And as I picked up my fork, I made a silent promise to the ghost of my father and to the future stretching out before me. No one gets sacrificed so someone else can pretend they're a hero. Not in my house, not in my name. The ambush was over. The meal could finally begin. With the ledger finally balanced and her legacy reclaimed, Blaire proved that the best revenge is simply building a life they can no longer touch. If you enjoyed this story of justice, please consider subscribing for more. What would you have done with Victor's letter? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.